back of my skull slammed against the concrete wall. This was the third time. The hands choking my neck were black as asphalt, all 5 fingers digging at least a centimeter into my flesh. My toes were forced off the ground, my combat boots scrambling desperately against the wall. But the most terrifying thing was, these hands had grown out of the wall. Beyond the wrists, there were no arms, just a flat, 2-dimensional black shadow plastered against the surface. It had only peeled away from the wall by about 20 centimeters, just enough to lock firmly around my windpipe. Under the flashing red emergency lights in the corridor, I saw the shadow's full form. It was my shadow. It wasn't struggling like I was. It stood perfectly straight, its head tilted to the left, the corner of its mouth split into a matte black, lightless sneer. Ever since that eerie red aurora had enveloped this Alaskan outpost, the laws of physics had completely broken down. The shadows on the walls no longer mimicked our movements. They had come alive, crawling out one by one from their 2-dimensional planes, preparing to kill us and then replace us. 96 hours ago, the Alaska Joint Aerospace Command issued a G5 level geomagnetic storm warning. Staff Sergeant Riggs, the communications chief at Chukhitsk Outpost, notified all personnel to implement equipment protection measures. I was in the basement level repairing a UV disinfectant lamp. The inner surface of the quartz tube was coated with black, thread-like filaments, fine as hair, forming a web-like pattern on the tube wall. The maintenance log noted suspected fungal contamination, but it had not been reported. That evening at 1800 hours, the aurora appeared. First, a vast expanse of green, lasting about 6 minutes before the entire sky flickered and shifted to a deep crimson. The duty log recorded the abnormal aurora persisting for 17 minutes. After it faded, every single transformer on the base burned out simultaneously. All communications equipment went dead. Satellite phones output only white noise. 2,100 hours. Private First Class Finch discovered his writing hand cast no shadow on the logbook. The entire 11-man team conducted a check. The 9 personnel exposed to the aurora had lost their shadows. Corporal Peterson and Finch, who had been inside the metal-shielded watchtower, remained unaffected. Lost did not mean detached. The outlines of all 9 men were still visible on the walls, but their movements followed with a 0.5 to 1 second delay. Day 2 daylight masked the anomaly. At 1830 hours, as night fell again, Lieutenant Harris ordered the team split into 2 groups to investigate the comms failure. I was assigned to Team B with Garcia and Riggs. Approximately 30 hours after shadow loss, we discovered a black humanoid silhouette on the exterior wall of a radio relay station 400 meters from the outpost. The silhouette's posture matched exactly that of Riggs, who had been performing maintenance there 10 minutes prior. The angle of his bent back, the position of his left hand braced against the wall, the tilt of his right shoulder, all corresponded frame by frame. I scanned it with thermal imaging. No heat source. Touching the edge of the silhouette with my fingertip gave a static shock sting. When I pulled back, my fingertip was coated in a black powder that smelled of ozone mixed with rotting meat. Lieutenant Harris took pictures with a digital camera. In each successive photo, the silhouette grew clearer, from a blurred outline in the first to visible finger whirls by the fourth. The lieutenant smashed the camera. On the return trip, Garcia, who was covering the rear, suddenly screamed. When the team turned, he was face down in the snow. A black humanoid shape was positioned on the snow's surface where his back would be, its hands pressing down towards his cervical spine. The shadow's hands extended from the flat plane of the snow, a physical attachment on a 2-dimensional projection surface, its fingers sinking into the fabric of Garcia's cold-weather gear at the nape of his neck. Lieutenant Harris fired a 3-round burst into the torso of the shadow on the snow. 3 bullet holes appeared simultaneously on Garcia's back, the trajectory passing vertically through his gear, his spine, and his thoracic cavity. He died instantly. Damage inflicted upon a shadow was synchronously mapped onto the host's physical body. Snow surfaces, walls, any 2-dimensional surface that had once cast a shadow, all were hunting grounds. The remaining 8 men retreated to the outpost's main building, sealing all doors and windows. Dozens of black humanoid outlines on the corridor walls began sliding erratically, shifting horizontally, stretching vertically, intertwining and overlapping. No sound source, no vibration. The black silhouettes moved freely across the walls, their speed fluctuating, their direction changing at will, like a tank of stirred black liquid frozen onto the surface. Approximately 44 hours after shadow loss. 0200 hours. Corporal Peterson let out a cry from the second-floor restroom. It couldn't even be called a call for help, just a short, sharp gasp of air forced from a throat seized by utter terror. I was in the hallway counting magazines. When I pushed the door open, his right hand was still pointing at the mirror above the sink. It reflected his own face, but the reflection's hands were braced against the inner edge of the mirror frame, pushing outward. Its knuckles were bent, gripping the aluminum frame, palms exerting force. The mirror glass bulged outward about 3 centimeters. Centered on the 2 points where the hands gripped, a spiderweb of cracks radiated towards the corners. The Raal Peterson stood half a meter from the mirror, his hands hanging at his sides. The one in the mirror was climbing out. At the same moment, a dense barrage of impacts erupted from the main entrance on the first floor. The sound wasn't knocking at all. The thick wooden door bulged inward with 5 human-shaped protrusions, varying in height, each contour mirroring a hunter silhouette once cast on the outer wall. The solid pine door, 5 centimeters thick, now bowed to the brink of wood fiber fracture. Hinge screws pulled an inch from the doorframe. All the static silhouettes on the corridor walls had vanished. They had peeled off the surfaces and were now battering the door from outside. Lieutenant Harris charged down the stairs, M4 braced against his shoulder, firing a 3-round burst at the main door. 5 bullets punched through the wood, gouging holes in the outer wall. The impacts didn't cease. The half-peeled shadows outside showed no reaction to the shots. They were mere projections, their host's flesh not on that 2-dimensional plane outside. The rule of synchronized damage had no host to map to. The real hosts were all inside. The fluorescent tube overhead exploded. Glass shards hit the floor as emergency red lights flickered on, bathing the corridor in blood-red illumination. Roll call. Private First Class Quinn was missing. 15 seconds later, from the infirmary came a sound like viscous liquid being forced through a narrow-mouthed container, but no screams. I was the first into the infirmary. Quinn lay supine on the exam table, the back of his head pressed against the stainless steel edge, his neck arched backward in a hollow suspension. Crouched on his chest was a black humanoid entity, about 2 meters tall, compressed into a squat that matched the torso width of an adult male, utterly black, no texture, no reflection. Its knees pinned Quinn's collarbones, and its hands were stuffing black fibrous matter into his mouth. The fibers, bundled in strands about 2 millimeters thick, accumulated at his tongue root, throat, and tracheal bifurcation, some spilling into his nostrils and eye sockets. Quinn's corneas had turned uniformly black, suffused with black filamentous infiltrates, iris and pupil outlines indistinguishable. All 7 orifices oozed similar fibers, slowly growing from ear canals, nostrils, and mouth corners like black hyphae. He was still breathing, his chest rising and falling, but his airway was clogged. Each exhalation forced foam laced with black threads from his throat. This entity was Quinn's shadow, an old silhouette cast on the infirmary wall 3 months ago during a shift, activated by the red aurora. I swung the M4 stock horizontally into the entity's head. There was no impact recoil, no hard resistance, like smashing into a vat of freezing oil at -40 degrees. The stock sank in without obstruction, as if into a mass of icy sludge, never hitting bone. The entity's head dispersed into black mist at the point of contact, then reaggregated after the stock passed, reforming its head's outline. It turned to look at me, its face already growing Quinn's features, the curve of his brow, the width of his nose, the thickness of his lips layering in correspondence, the expression a serene smile. Sergeant Major Burke's roar came from the corridor. Everyone to the basement, to the lit areas. 8 of us descended the stairs. The basement was the only operational zone in the outpost. 2 diesel heaters burned continuously, maintaining a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius, lit by the furnace glow and 2 emergency fluorescents. I took the rear, sealing the fire door behind me, and through the gap saw dozens of black silhouettes still moving erratically on the corridor walls. One silhouette stopped on the wall directly opposite the fire door, its posture matching my sideways stance as I closed the door, with a delay of about 0.8 seconds. Roll call in the basement. Sergeant Riggs was missing. Quinn was missing. Garcia was dead. Finch sat against the wall, hands clasped behind his head, rocking back and forth, muttering a sequence of numbers, later found to be the seconds count between each breath. Effective combat strength, 6. I turned to check the southeast corner of the basement and saw my own shadow at the junction of wall and floor. It was curled up in the corner, knees against its chest, arms wrapped around its shins, forehead pressed to its knees, a perfect fetal position. I stood, right hand gripping the M4's pistol grip, left hand cradling the handguard, weight on my left foot. That curled shadow in the corner slowly unfurled. First the left arm released from the legs, palm bracing the ground. Then the cervical vertebrae lifted one by one, head parting from the knees. The movement was fluid, with the rhythm of muscle exertion, like someone waking from sleep. I stood up. The black outline on the wall matched my height and build, but its right hand held no gun. It hung naturally by its side, fingers opening and closing rhythmically, as if testing its range of motion. I looked down at my own right hand, gripping the M4's pistol grip, index finger resting outside the trigger guard, knuckles pale from the cold. When I looked up again, the shadow's face had turned about 15 degrees, facing me. The emergency fluorescent light swayed slightly in the heat convection from the diesel furnace. All other shadows shifted with the light source. My shadow remained still. The light flickered, casting everyone's shadows into a restless dance, but it remained stubbornly fixed in place. It was alive, but for now it still clung to the wall. Finch's counting voice suddenly halted. From the corridor upstairs came a sound like bare feet slapping against the wet terrazzo floor, devoid of the hard, resonant thumps of military boots. The noise moved from the first floor to the stairwell, descending step by step, and finally paused on the other side of the basement fire door. Sergeant Burke whispered a command for everyone to deactivate their weapon safeties and remain absolutely still. The diesel furnace emitted a low, rumbling hum, the flames dancing behind the glass observation window. The metal door had no peephole, no viewing window, but there was a 3mm gap at the bottom. The emergency red light from the corridor cast a thin red line on the floor inside the door. The red line was interrupted in 12 places. Something was crouched outside the door, blocking the light. The 12 interruptions corresponded to the width of fingers. An entity was lying on the ground outside the door, peering through the gap. The wet, sticky sounds from outside the fire door persisted for 41 minutes, ceasing abruptly at 0241. The 12 shadows blocking the light vanished simultaneously, and the red light reformed into a complete, unbroken line. No one in the basement moved. The sound of their breathing was drowned out by the roar of the diesel furnace. Sergeant Burke maintained his position, gun trained on the door, for another 22 minutes before confirming there was no further activity and issuing orders for a rotating watch. 6 hours after the first confrontation, the outpost fell into an eerie silence. The black, human-shaped outlines on the corridor walls stopped moving, reverting to static silhouettes as if they had never been activated. Based on this, Burke deduced that the entities were only active at night and suggested we hold our position in the basement until the period of midnight sun, when we could attempt a breakout. I used a handheld UV fluorescence lamp to scan each room, 365 nanometers, a non-sterilizing wavelength. The UV light caused the shadows to emit a faint, dark red glow, similar to the way a retina reflects light. I mapped the distribution throughout the building. A total of 41 distinct shadows adhered to the walls of 17 rooms, some overlapping in the same plane, distinguishable only by the intensity of their glow. While Finch was receiving sedation in the medical room, he suddenly raised his finger, pointing to the ceiling above his bed. The human-shaped outline on the ceiling was slowly opening and closing its mouth, about once every 2 seconds, with an exaggerated movement. The upper lip curled up to the nostrils, the jaw dropped to the collarbone. Finch read the lips. It's saying, "Found you." I returned to the basement, where Lieutenant Harris was reviewing the notes left by Garcia before his death. Garcia had observed a crucial pattern. The shadows would repeat all the movements of their hosts within 24 hours, with increasing precision over time. If the survivors maintained fixed patrol routes and regular schedules, the shadows would anticipate these positions and wait on the walls. Burke ordered everyone to break their routines, randomly changing locations each hour and prohibiting anyone from staying alone in any room for more than 15 minutes. At 0650, a sentry reported a moving heat source approaching the main building. The thermal imaging confirmed it, a human-shaped outline with a surface temperature of 36.5 degrees Celsius, walking with a gait identical to Sergeant Riggs. Riggs had been missing for over 10 hours. He stumbled to the front of the building, and Lieutenant Harris, through the gap in the door, ordered him to repeat the day's password. Riggs's voice, tone, and speed were exactly as they were in memory. The lieutenant unlocked the door. When Riggs entered, I noticed something odd as his military boots crossed the threshold. His footprints in the snow were black, protruding about 5 millimeters above the surface. As he walked, the snow didn't sink but instead seemed to bleed, with black marks floating up where his feet had been. Another anomaly. After entering, he instinctively lifted his left foot to change into indoor shoes, but as his left leg rose, his right forearm swung in sync. He used his right hand to balance, a movement that should have been linked to his left. Riggs was left-handed. I didn't raise the alarm, because when I turned, I saw that all the shadows on the basement walls had vanished. 41 silhouettes had left their original points of attachment without anyone noticing. Now, the only shadow on the wall was my own. It was raising its right hand. My right hand was hanging at my side. That wasn't my shadow. It was raising its right hand, while my right hand hung at my side. The emergency fluorescent light swayed in the heat convection from the diesel furnace, causing everyone's shadows to move with the light source, except for the one on the wall. It remained still, fingers fully spread, the palm perpendicular to the wall, as if someone were pushing from the other side. I looked down. My own right hand was still on the M4 grip, my index finger resting outside the trigger guard, the knuckles pale and blue. 2 hours after Riggs returned to the unit, he answered every structural question about the outpost with precision, the location of the distribution room's breaker panel, the startup sequence for the backup generator, the call signs for every room. But when he spoke to each of us, he mirrored our habitual gestures. While talking to Lieutenant Harris, his left shoulder twitched unconsciously every 10-odd seconds, the lieutenant's signature stress reaction. When addressing me, his left hand began pressing down on the joints of his right index, middle, and ring fingers in a steady rhythm. Click, 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 the force, tempo, and sequence of each finger matching my own stress relief habit frame by frame. He was reflecting us like a mirror. Burke pulled Lieutenant Harris into the diesel furnace room's alcove around 0750 hours, whispering a few words. The lieutenant then privately summoned me and Finch into the same alcove, with Burke finally bringing in a 19-year-old rookie named Cole. His astigmatic glasses scratched all over, his grip on the M4 still stiff from basic training drills. Burke sealed the door shut, scanned the four of us, and said, "Riggs isn't human anymore." Harris walked to the alcove door and slid the bolt open. Riggs stood 2 meters outside, not approaching, just standing there, smiling. When the lieutenant asked what he'd experienced after the power outage that night, Riggs's reply mimicked the communications chief's exact tone. Every pause and stress perfectly aligned. "I've been with you all along." He pointed to the basement wall, where his own shadow had been recorded, directly above the heating pipes. Now the concrete surface was smooth and clean, devoid of any outline. Harris drew his pistol and pressed the muzzle against Riggs's forehead, sinking it about 3 millimeters into the skin. Riggs leaned his forehead forward, pushing the muzzle back half a centimeter, and said, "Fire! See who the bullet hits." The lieutenant shifted his aim and fired sideways at the corridor wall, where several shadows still clung, one of them Riggs's, its head tilted 12 degrees to the left. The round struck the silhouette's head area, but Riggs himself stood motionless, showing no sign of impact. Inside the basement, Finch, leaning against the wall, suddenly stiffened and pitched forward. A bullet hole appeared on the left side of his occipital bone, just above the external occipital protuberance, the entry angle matching the one in the wall. The round didn't penetrate. The slug lodged inside his skull. Finch fell face first to the floor, limbs limp, dead on the spot. That moment, the rules escalated definitively. Once a replacement completed the exchange, harming it no longer redirected damage onto itself. The damage was randomly transferred to another nearby living person not yet replaced. The link for simultaneous injury had been hijacked. The replacement Riggs began to laugh, his lips stretching sideways until the corners tore to the anterior edge of the masseter muscle. Inside the gap, the space between upper and lower dental arches was filled with black fibrous bundles. The fibers writhed between his teeth, like a compressed mass of black silk threads slowly expanding. Black veins began surfacing from within Riggs's body, starting at the supraclavicular fossa, traveling up along the common carotid artery, creeping over the mandible into his face, spreading through the infraorbital foramina to both cheeks. The lines branched like tree roots under the skin, uneven in thickness, their main trunks pulsing in sync with the diesel furnace's piston. His whole body looked like paper being soaked from within by black liquid, cracks spreading beneath the skin while the surface remained intact. He lunged at Cole, moving at least a third faster than a human sprint. His right hand seized Cole's left wrist and slammed the entire arm onto the metal table outside the alcove. The moment Cole's forearm touched the table, it vanished. A three-dimensional limb compressed into a two-dimensional plane. A forearm silhouette appeared on the table's surface, revealing the outlines of the ulna, radius, and shadowy finger bones within, like a reverse-exposed X-ray. When Cole pulled his arm back, the forearm and hand were still attached to his body, but the skin, muscle, and bone had all been compressed into a thicknessless plane. His arm became a sheet of paper, unable to bend, incapable of gripping, sensation gone. He tried to make a fist with his left hand, and the silhouette on the table mimicked the motion in sync, but his brain received no proprioceptive feedback from that arm. I leveled my M4, the front sight oscillating across every visible part of the replacement's torso, but I couldn't pull the trigger. Randomized damage transfer meant any round hitting the replacement could kill Harris, Burke, or myself. Harris ordered a spread out. Direction. Different rooms on different floors, maximize target dispersion. I calculated the nearest safe route was the armory on the second floor, based on known ammunition stock. As he turned, Cole lost balance from his left arm's two-dimensionalization, staggering alone in the corridor, exposed. The substitute, Riggs, pressed his entire body against the hallway wall. Cole was slammed into the wall. Bone and flesh were crushed into a paper-thin sheet within 3 seconds. Finally, even his terrified features smeared into a dead black silhouette on the wall. A complete human shape lingered on the wall for about 2 seconds, still bearing Cole's face and uniform color, then rapidly faded, khaki, skin tone, iris brown desaturated to grayscale in sequence, and after 3 seconds, only a pitch-black silhouette remained. Substitute Riggs peeled another silhouette from the wall. The silhouette made a tearing sound like 3M tape being ripped from glass as it detached. Once free from the plane, it quickly expanded and filled out, forming a three-dimensional humanoid entity within 3 seconds. Its appearance, height, and posture matched exactly that of the deceased Private First Class Cole. Substitute Cole stood beside Substitute Riggs. The substitutes were multiplying, with 41 hunters across 17 rooms in the entire building entering their 72-hour complete state. The outpost would have 41 substitute entities. The confirmed substitutes numbered at least 3, corresponding to the missing Riggs, Quinn, and the recently converted Finch. Burke shouted the list of remaining real humans from the cubicle, me, Harris, Burke, 3. He used the past tense. The diesel furnace flame in the basement suddenly jumped violently. The fuel pressure gauge needle dropped from the green zone to 0. Behind the furnace door's glass observation window, the flame shifted from orange-yellow to dark red, then to black. The backup lighting battery pack simultaneously lost power. Absolute darkness descended on the basement, lasting about 4 seconds. In the dark, there were hard-soled boot impacts on concrete, at least 4 distinct sources, but all came from the direction of the walls. When the emergency lights reactivated, Substitute Riggs and Substitute Cole had already moved to the single exit of the basement. Their stance was off, Their soles weren't fully touching the ground. There was a gap of about 3 millimeters of continuous black material between their feet and the concrete. Substitute Riggs spoke, using the communications sergeant's voice. "Stop running, Ryan. Stop running, Ryan." When Substitute Riggs uttered that line in the comm sergeant's voice, the diesel furnace flame in the basement went completely out. The emergency fluorescent lights still worked, powered by an independent battery pack, but the luminous flux had dropped by about 30%. The extreme cold was mercilessly draining the last of the battery's charge, the light visibly dimming. Lieutenant Harris moved from my right toward the third-floor stairwell. His combat boots struck the concrete steps in alternating rhythmic impacts. Burke entered the generator room from the rear of the basement. The metal door closed, the deadbolt clicking into its slot, the sound echoing twice in the enclosed space. My path was the second-floor armory. As I passed the first-floor corridor transfer platform, I saw my reflection in the double-layer bulletproof glass window at the corridor's end. In the glass reflection, a black humanoid shape clung to my back. It wasn't a shadow on the ground. It had climbed up the wall and attached itself to my back. Its torso conformed to the outline of my cold-weather jacket, legs wrapped around my waist, ankles locked in front of my abdomen. Its head rested on the nape of my neck, jaw set in the depression between the 7th cervical vertebra and the 1st thoracic vertebra. I turned to face the glass. The entity's head emerged about 5 centimeters above my right shoulder. No facial features, but a distinct head shape. It was looking at me in the mirror. Laundry room. I slammed my back against the wall 3 times. The first impact sent a shock through the concrete that numbed my shoulder blades. The second hit the back of my skull against the wall. The third used my body weight and momentum. The entity didn't dislodge. Instead, the grip of its thighs tightened, its calves climbing from around my abdomen to the lower edge of my ribcage. I grabbed a small stainless steel mirror from the equipment cabinet, adjusted the angle to reflect my nape. The black entity's mouth was pressed against the skin of my neck. No gap between lips and epidermis. It was breathing, its rhythm independent of my diaphragm's movements. The exhaled air was colder than the surrounding atmosphere. Black filamentous infiltration had already appeared on my nape skin, as fine as capillary pathways, spreading from the contact point toward the occipital bone. My conscious mind experienced gaps. One moment I was holding the mirror to observe. The next, my left hand had unconsciously unbuttoned the top 2 fasteners of my cold-weather jacket, and my right hand was pulling the zipper down. After the third gap, my right index finger was already resting on the M4 trigger, the muzzle pointing at my own left combat boot's toe. Electrical tape, a roll of 19mm wide black 3M tape in my right pant leg tool pouch. I tore off 3 strips with one hand. The first wrapped my palm around the grip. The second wrapped my thumb, fixing it to the side of the rifle body. The third sealed the trigger guard opening to prevent my index finger from entering. The tape crossed and overlapped on the back of my hand. My right hand was physically locked onto the weapon. Third-floor communications room. Lieutenant Harris sat at the long-wave radio console, his back to the door, the microphone in his left hand, repeating the outpost's coordinate call sign. As I entered, he spun around sharply, the muzzle of his M9 pointing at the triangular area of my face before lowering it in 0. For seconds, identification complete. But his grip on the gun had changed. His right index finger stretched straight, resting outside the trigger guard, his left hand supporting the grip, switching to a right-handed hold. Beneath the skin of his right hand, black lines ran longitudinally along the tendons, extending from the proximal interphalangeal joints to the back of the wrist. The imposter Harris spoke with Harris's voice. "Burke is finished." On the metal table beside the console, the real Lieutenant Harris lay face down. His skull, cervical vertebrae, scapula, and thoracic vertebrae compressed into a plane of 0 thickness. The human outline on the plane still retained the color of his uniform, the lieutenant bars on his shoulder clearly visible. His eyes were open, the eyeballs still moving within the plane. "Now it's just you." The imposter Harris stood up, meeting my gaze at eye level. He offered a choice. Wait for my shadow to complete the full transformation in 72 hours, or accept the transformation voluntarily. Maintaining consciousness, existing as a shadow. The imposters inherit all the memories of their hosts. We are still us, just in a different form. 11 silhouettes lined up in a single row along the corridor wall, corresponding to Garcia, Quinn, Riggs, Finch, Cole, Burke, Harris, and the 4 unmentioned missing soldiers. The 11 silhouettes raised their right hands in unison, waving movements uniform, rhythms synchronized, wrist swings perfectly aligned. The shadow behind me began to lift my right hand. The muscles in my right arm spasmed violently, out of my control. The shadow was forcibly taking over my body. My right arm lifted against my will, the elbow bending at an angle that increased by about 15 degrees per second. I bit through my lower lip, my left hand gripping my right wrist, shifting my weight backward, my left heel bracing against the communications room door frame, engaging in a tug of war with my own shadow. My fingers were now 7 centimeters from the M4's grip. Preparations for the transformation. The imposter Harris took a step toward me, his right hand extended, fingers together, the tips aimed at the center of my forehead. I fell backward. I relinquished the vertical axis of my body, letting the fall be the only action I could fully control. Tumbling down the 3rd floor stairwell, my right arm hit the railing first, then the edge of a step. On the second impact, the midshaft of my radius fractured, the sound of the break transmitted through bone conduction to my inner ear. The excruciating pain shot through my brain, forcibly severing the shadow's control over my right arm. The pain disrupted the synchronization. 2nd floor, medical bay. I dragged my right side down the corridor, the angle of the fracture in my right arm now visibly distorted, the fractured ends creating a prominent bulge under the skin. The UV disinfection lamp remained in place. Its tube was damaged, the quartz glass now filled with black, fibrous material, 5 times denser than it had been 96 hours ago. Garcia's maintenance log noted that the outpost's warehouse had a spare lamp tube, model G36T5L, with a 254 nanometer germicidal UV wavelength. This tube had been left on the warehouse shelf, labeled as low priority, and never replaced. At the end of the east corridor on the 2nd floor, I encountered the imposter Burke. He appeared intact, his right hand gripping an M249 light machine gun, his left hand dragging the flattened body of a soldier. The soldier's ankles held in Burke's hand, the torso sliding on the ground with no thickness, like a rolled-out human carpet, still retaining the color of the uniform and skin, but with 0 thickness at the edges. The soldier's eyes followed my movements, rotating within the 2-dimensional plane. The imposter Burke opened fire. 5 rounds scattered on the concrete wall beside me. Each bullet that struck the shadow on the wall elicited a synchronized scream from the imposter Harris in the medical bay. The rule of synchronous damage applied to the imposters as well. Hitting the shadow on the wall would randomly harm an imposter entity. This was my weapon. There were no living hosts among the imposters. I fired at the shadow on the wall beside the imposter Burke, 2 shots in quick succession. The first hit the shadow's midline, the second missed. A hole exploded in the imposter Burke's chest, black fibers oozing out instead of blood. He fell, the M249 sliding 2 meters from his grasp. 3rd shelf in the warehouse. The spare lamp tube in its original packaging, a box covered with an even layer of dust. I opened it. The tube was undamaged, the quartz glass clear, the electrode prongs at both ends showing no signs of oxidation. Unable to use my right hand, I replaced the tube with my left, rotating the old tube a quarter turn to remove it from the socket, aligning the new tube and rotating it in the opposite direction to secure it. I connected the power, pressed the switch. The 254 nanometer ultraviolet light glowed a pale violet. The moment it lit, 5 hunter shadows on the walls of the infirmary emitted a sound simultaneously, approximately 3,000 hertz, similar to the corona discharge from high-voltage power lines. Under the UV light, the black outlines quickly deactivated, their surface shifting from pitch black to dark gray, then to a light gray, the material transforming from a flexible film to a rigid, brittle shell. The edges crumbled and fell off, breaking into irregular, light gray fragments upon hitting the ground. The process took about 4 seconds. The hunter shadow on my back convulsed as the UV beam swept over it, contracting, stiffening, and detaching. It tore away with a sound like adhesive breaking, landing as a 2 mm thick cracked black shell. After breaking, it showed no signs of regenerating. Control over my right arm was restored, and the pain from the fracture continued as I moved, but the movement commands were no longer intercepted or overridden. The UV sterilization lamp had an effective irradiation diameter of 3 meters. There were 41 hunter shadows distributed across 3 floors of the outpost. I needed to expand the coverage. I detached the UV lamp's tube from its base. Welding a copper wire to each electrode, I connected them to the 12-volt DC output of the infirmary's emergency battery pack. The voltage was too low. The lamp required 400 volts AC and a ballast. I removed the electronic ballast from the ceiling's fluorescent light, connected it in series, with the input end to the battery pack and the output end to the lamp's electrodes. Cutting aluminum foil from an emergency blanket, I folded it into a parabolic reflector, placing the lamp at the focal point. The entire assembly was wrapped and secured with electrical tape, and the handle was taken from the aluminum rod of a broken mop. When I pressed the switch, a pale violet beam shot out, expanding the effective irradiation diameter to 5 meters. The edges of the light spot on the wall emitted a faint, blue-white fluorescence under the UV light. On the 3rd floor, in the communications room, the long-wave radio was still transmitting. The frequency and outpost coordinates Lieutenant Harris had set were cycling, the pointer on the carrier signal strength meter barely oscillating at the 0.5 microvolt mark. I picked up the microphone, pressed the transmit button, and reported our position, the number of survivors, and the nature of the threat in standard military language, repeating it 3 times. After releasing the button, the receiver emitted white noise, interspersed with intermittent atmospheric whistles. 12 seconds later, there was a brief, structured signal in the white noise, possibly a distant ionospheric reflection or a self-excitation in the receiver's gain circuit. It was impossible to confirm. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. The replacements were no longer lurking. From the doorway of the communications room, I observed 15 replacement entities stood in a row at the end of the corridor, corresponding to Garcia, Quinn, Riggs, Finch, Cole, Burke, Harris, and 8 complete forms that had proliferated from the wall shadows. Their movement was uniform, hovering 5 millimeters above the ground, propelled in suspension, with a consistent layer of black substance between their feet and the floor. All 15 spoke in unison, their voices alternating between the original hosts. They recounted the memory of a Syrian boy, about 7 years old, wearing a blue-striped shirt, who fell into my arms after being shot in the abdomen. The boy's 3rd button was missing, his collar embroidered with an Arabic name, and his last words were, "It hurts." This memory I had only verbally disclosed once to a military psychologist during my enlistment evaluation, with Lieutenant Harris, then a company commander, sitting in the back of the room. They repeated it 3 times. Each cycle switched to a different host's voice, finally unifying into a multi-layered, harmonized chorus, still uttering those words. Their hands simultaneously reached out toward the corridor walls. The forearms of all replacements sliced into the concrete walls like knives through butter, without damaging the structural integrity. 15 black forearm-sized holes appeared in the walls. They began to tear the walls horizontally. Concrete, rebar, insulation, and drywall were slowly peeled away, emitting the metallic screech of rebar being pulled from concrete. Their objective was clear: to destroy the outpost's building structure, eliminate all 2-dimensional surfaces capable of casting shadows, and cause the main building to collapse, exposing the permafrost layer directly to the aurora in the night sky. The foundation of the outpost cracked in the early hours of the morning. A longitudinal crack appeared on the 1st floor, initially about 2 centimeters wide, expanding to 40 centimeters in 19 minutes. The crack extended downward, piercing through the concrete foundation and into the permafrost. Looking down into the crack, I saw a giant, non-carbon-based structure, resembling a human neural network magnified by tens of thousands of times. Each black fiber was about 1.5 meters in diameter, weaving vertically and horizontally, branching, converging, and branching again, forming a spherical topology with a diameter of about 200 meters. Light pulses traveled between nodes within the network, pulsing about once per second, synchronized with the diesel furnace's piston frequency. With each pulse, The black material of all replacements and the remaining wall shadows darkened incrementally. A crimson aurora erupted from the apex node of this web-like structure, but it was no aurora at all. It was something lurking deep within the permafrost, breaching the ruins, spewing blood-red energy pulses into the atmosphere. An ancient entity had lived beneath the frozen earth all along, and the red aurora was its breath, its excrement. I hoisted the ultraviolet emitter and descended the stairs to the edge of a fissure on the first floor. The beam lanced downward. Black fibrous material clinging to the fissure walls writhed violently under the UV light, charring and sloughing off. But what was exposed were merely the outermost tendrils of the entity's network. Its core node buried some 40 meters deep in the permafrost. The UV lamp illuminated a 5-meter diameter. The entity spanned 200 meters. The fissure's edge continued to widen. The replacers abandoned the outpost ruins, moving down the opposite side of the crack along the frozen wall. 15 black humanoid forms clung like geckos, inverted, sliding downward across the icy surface. The black substance on their soles adhered to and peeled away from the ice, producing a continuous low-frequency tearing sound. They were descending into the fissure to make direct contact with the entity's core. I gripped the UV emitter and began climbing down the northern ice wall of the fissure. My left hand clutched frozen ledges and jagged permafrost. My right hand, fractured, hooked the aluminum lamp pole with my forearm and elbow. At about 15 meters down, the remaining support structure of the outpost's main building above gave way. A whole concrete slab plunged from the fissure's mouth. It scraped the ice wall, carrying shards of ice and frozen earth into the depths. The impact sound, traveling upward, was muffled by the permafrost into a hollow thud. The replacers approached from 3 directions. I swept the UV beam horizontally. It caught one of them about 5 meters ahead. In the pale violet patch, it froze for 0. 3 seconds. Then its surface began to gray and char. Its body collapsed from 3 dimensions into 2, like a deflated skin sack slapping back against the ice wall, crumbling into ashen debris that scattered from the frozen surface. The others dodged the beam, advancing around the UV emitter's blind spots. One carried a torn metal desktop as a shield. Its aluminum panel reflected the UV, the beam ricocheting twice off the ice wall before fading to harmless levels. Another dragged Cole's flattened corpse as a meat shield. Cole's 2-dimensional face still held the expression of his death. His mouth twisted to the left, frozen in the struggle of his final scream. The UV light swept over Cole's planar remains. In the instant they turned to ash, a human voice emerged from within the flat surface. 50 decibels, sharp and shrill. A single, brief, agonized cry. The last vestige of his consciousness, screaming before total annihilation. Cole's final sound echoed from the plain. At the bottom of the fissure, the ancient entity's core node was exposed along the ice wall. A black fiber optic main cable, roughly 4 meters in diameter, its surface studded with bulbous structures resembling neuronal synapses spaced about 20 centimeters apart. Each swollen node pulsed with independent light, its rhythm out of sync with the others, the internal tempo close to the conduction velocity of a single nerve impulse. Dozens of human bodies were embedded in the ice wall. Depths ranged from half a meter to 2 meters from the surface, frozen at various angles. Upright, inverted, curled on their sides, sprawled. Their clothing and gear spanned 3 centuries. A 19th century Russian fur hunter's reindeer skin coat, a World War II Army Air Forces pilot's A2 leather jacket and flight cap, and older, pre-literate indigenous waterproof parkas stitched from seal intestines. All eyelids were open, their eyeballs coated with a transparent layer of ice crystals. Behind the lens, intact iris colors and pupil outlines were visible. Some eyeballs still tracked the UV beam with slow, deliberate movements, a locked-in state. The people frozen in that ice wall, their eyes were still moving. They were alive, their consciousness trapped inside this ancient monster, forcibly reduced to fodder for it to learn how to mimic humans. The UV emitter's battery gauge dropped to 30%. The lamp's output weakened with the voltage, the 5-meter irradiation circle shrinking to about 5 meters. I had to decide before the power ran out. Using this beam to burn a 200-meter diameter entity was like trying to dry a lake with a lighter. A flare gun, the standard issue model 406 signal pistol hung on the equipment rack. I'd grabbed it when building the UV emitter. Aluminum body, 12 gauge, loaded with a single red parachute flare. A 2,800-degree flare, detonating inside its body like a thunderclap. It was like igniting a miniature sun in the abyss, a blinding flash that tore through all the darkness in an instant. Secure the UV emitter to a protruding ridge of ice, aiming the beam at an exposed black fiber trunk cable on the surface of the core node. Under sustained irradiation, the fibers begin to solidify, color shifting from black to gray to white, the calcification advancing inward at roughly 0.3 millimeters per second. Raise the flare gun to shoulder height, depress the muzzle 15 degrees, and aim at the weakened zone of the same core node, where UV light has burned the surface brittle but hasn't penetrated the inner interface. Squeeze the trigger. The propellant detonates, launching the flare at an initial velocity of roughly 90 meters per second from the barrel. The warhead strikes the embrittled surface core node, igniting the magnesium-strontium payload on impact. A 2,800 degrees Celsius combustion core melts through the black fiber's solidified shell, and the ultraviolet band within the intense light floods through the scorched aperture into the entity's interior. The creature's innards can't withstand such radiance. Those black fibers, as if doused in concentrated acid, calcify and blanch at a horrifying speed from the inside out. Every fiber bundle in the spherical network turns gray in cascade. The pulse rhythm syncing across nodes loses coherence. Frequency accelerates from once per second to dozens per second, then halts abruptly. The entire entity convulses. A 200-meter diameter spherical structure contracts in unison beneath the permafrost, like a giant sea anemone's full-body spasm after contact with a salt crystal. Infrasound. Frequency around 7 Hz. Sound pressure level high enough to shatter ice crystals on the wall surface via resonance. Both my eardrums rupture on the first infrasonic pulse. Blood streams from my ear canals, its temperature dropping in the sub-zero air to the edge of coagulation. Every individual in the substitute collective halts simultaneously. Graying from the feet upward, the calcification front advancing evenly past calves, torso, skull. The three-dimensional black entity degrades entirely into brittle, gray-white solid, shattering under its own weight into irregular fragments that scatter across the ice wall. The residual hunting shadows on the walls all dissolve into powder and peel away from the surface. Dust hangs in the air for about 4 seconds before settling. From the ruins of the outpost, Lieutenant Harris's voice carries, originating from the communications room, now collapsed by 1 story. His body, crushed flat against a metal desk, reverse inflates back into 3 dimensions after the entity's death. Forcibly yanked from a 2-dimensional compressed state into 3 dimensions, his organs and bones are a bloody pulp. He convulses like a dying fish, clinging to only a thread of intermittent breath. The aurora's color jumps from to the normal green of excited oxygen atoms. Night snow begins to fall, the flakes tinged pale green as they pass through the auroral curtain, quickly accumulating on the ruins near the crack's edge. The ice walls on either side of the permafrost fissure start to slowly close. The ancient entity's remains, in their contraction, pull the surrounding permafrost inward in a centripetal collapse. The gray-white, rigidified residue is permanently sealed 70 meters deep beneath the permafrost, covered anew by soil, ice, and time. I climb up the crack's ice wall. The UV emitter's battery dies as I reach the fissure's mouth. The pale violet beam shrinks to a dark purple point before extinguishing. I roll over the edge onto the surface, lying supine on a mix of concrete rubble and snow from the outpost ruins. The pain in my fractured right arm fully releases as adrenaline metabolizes. A deep, persistent ache from torn periosteal-free nerve endings, localized and clear. Above, the green aurora rotates. Snowflakes land on my corneas and melt, merging with the blood still uncoagulated at my eyelid's edge, diluting into a pale red fluid that trickles into my ear canal. The shadow lying on the snow, a black human silhouette, its outline sharp against the ground's reflected light. It slowly retracts into my body, beginning at my feet, reestablishing contact with the soles of my combat boots, then layering upward. The shadow returns. 36 hours later, a Canadian Air Force 442 Transport and Rescue Squadron's 149 Cormorant helicopter lands on the leveled snow east of the outpost ruins. The rotor downwash blows away surface powder, exposing concrete rubble and frozen earth beneath. Search teams find 2 survivors in the communications room wreckage, me and Lieutenant Harris, who reverse inflated after being crushed. The lieutenant stops breathing mid-flight to Anchorage Joint Hospital due to bilateral tension pneumothorax combined with intracranial hemorrhage. Of the remaining 9 stationed personnel, 7 intact bodies are recovered. The other 2, completely pressed into the walls and destroyed during the main building's collapse, are declared missing. Anchorage General Hospital. Open reduction and internal fixation for a midshaft fracture of the right radius. Microscopic repair for bilateral traumatic tympanic membrane perforations, and debridement for second-degree frostbite on both feet. On the 7th postoperative day, a joint review team from the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency entered the room. 3 plainclothes personnel sat to the left of the hospital bed. 1 handled questioning, 1 operated a tape recorder, and 1 transcribed the projection displayed on the wall opposite me. I recounted the events at the outpost in chronological sequence, including the neural network structure of the ancient entity, the substitution mechanism, and the ultraviolet kill path. After listening, the questioner shut off the recording device, retrieved a standard non-disclosure agreement, and placed it on the folding table beside my bed, the printed typeface reading National Security Information Confidentiality Pledge. He stated that the investigation team had found no anomalous structures 70 meters beneath the outpost ruins in the frozen soil. The permafrost samples contained mineral deposits appearing grayish-white, likely shale fragments. After the room lights were turned off, the shadow cast by the desk lamp onto the wall mirrored every one of my movements with exact precision. Raise a hand, the shadow raised its hand. Rotate a wrist, the shadow rotated its wrist. Spread 5 fingers, the shadow spread 5 fingers. 0 delay, matching contours. On the day of discharge, in the military waiting lounge at Anchorage International Airport, I sat in a wheelchair passing by the corridor's floor-to-ceiling windows. The low-angle sunlight at 10 in the morning cast my shadow onto the ground from behind. The shadow moved in sync with my actions. When I pushed the wheelchair forward, the shadow's arms reached out to push. When I turned, the shadow's arms followed the turn. But the head's rotation lagged by roughly half a second, 0 delay for every other part, only the head. The wheelchair stopped. The shadow stopped. The shadow on the ground had a sharp outline and a normal posture, lying flat on the white floor tiles alongside the shadows of all other passengers in the lounge, collectively elongating as the sun slowly shifted. I spoke a single sentence at a volume only I could hear. The shadow neither answered nor showed any visible change. As the plane took off, the Alaska range outside the window lay blanketed in snow, the early morning sunlight striking the eastern slopes from the southeast. The shadows on the cabin floor interwove and overlapped with the movements of passengers in their seats. I looked down at my own shadow. It rested quietly on the dark gray nylon carpet beneath the seat, trembling in steady rhythm with the turbulence.